Oliver Cromwell, the man who killed a king from farmer to kingslayer, the ruthless rise of Oliver Cromwell. Imagine this. You're a simple English farmer, tending to your crops, minding your own Puritan business. Then one day, you put down your plough, pick up a sword, and end up signing the death warrant of a king. Sounds like a wild historical thriller, right? Well, that's exactly what happened with Oliver Cromwell, the man who did the unthinkable. He killed a king and shattered the idea that monarchs ruled by divine right. But what could possibly turn a man of the land into a kingslayer? Was it ambition, religious fervor, a deep hatred for bad governance, or maybe just one too many unfair taxes? The truth is, Cromwell's story is one of destiny, brutality, and a series of bad decisions, mostly by King Charles I. Buckle up, because this is the tale of how England's most unlikely warrior rose from obscurity, plunged his country into a civil war, and ultimately changed the course of history forever. Oliver Cromwell was born on April 25, 1599, in Huntingdon, England. He wasn't exactly a peasant, but he wasn't nobility either. His family had done well for themselves after the Reformation, moving up from brewers to minor landowners, thanks to some timely royal favor. Oh, and there was a little family connection. His great-great-uncle was Thomas Cromwell, the infamous chief minister to Henry VIII, who had once helped dissolve England's monasteries. So young Oliver had ambition in his blood. But at first there was little sign of greatness. He grew up in a relatively well-to-do Puritan household, attended Cambridge for a year, and then had to return home when his father died. In 1620, he married Elizabeth Bourchier, a woman from another prominent Puritan family. If life had gone according to plan, he would have spent his days farming and attending church. End of story. But then came the chaos. On March 27, 1625, King James I died, and his son, Charles I, took the throne. Now, Charles was the type of guy who truly believed in the divine right of kings. Basically, he thought God had personally anointed him to rule. That would have been fine, if he had been good at it. Unfortunately, Charles was about as politically savvy as a headless chicken. He immediately got into trouble with Parliament by marrying a Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria of France. Then he decided to fund expensive wars against Spain and France, wars that England was terrible at winning. The problem? He needed money to do it. Parliament, already suspicious of his Catholic sympathies, refused to give him more cash. So what did Charles do? He dissolved Parliament. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And when Parliament still refused to play nice, he just decided to rule without them. This was known as the personal rule, 1629 to 1640, but many saw it as tyranny. Charles raised illegal taxes, imprisoned people who didn't pay, and generally acted like a 17th-century Bond villain. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, Oliver Cromwell was quietly fuming. During these years, Cromwell had what can only be described as a midlife crisis. He lost money, had health issues, and suffered a deep religious transformation. One night, he had a feverish breakdown, which he later described as a moment of divine enlightenment. From that point on, he saw himself as a man chosen by God to fight for Puritanism. Then, in 1640, Charles made a huge mistake. He picked a fight with the Scots. Scotland, being mostly Presbyterian, was furious at Charles's attempts to impose Anglican practices on them. In retaliation, they invaded northern England. Charles, utterly broke and without a proper army, turns out divine right doesn't pay the bills, had no choice but to sue for peace. The Scots, now comfortably occupying the north like an uninvited guest who also eats all your food, responded with a polite but firm, "Sure, we'll leave, but two conditions. First, drop your religious madness. Second, pay us back for every single coin we spent marching down here." Charles, having the financial planning skills of a drunk gambler, was forced to agree. But to pay them off, he needed money, which meant, summoning Parliament. And that, dear reader, was the biggest mistake of his life. Charles, having a long history of dissolving parliaments faster than people dissolve New Year's resolutions, called what would later be mockingly named the Short Parliament in 1640. It lasted 3 weeks. Why? Because the MPs, sensing Charles's desperation, immediately started whining about his terrible policies instead of just handing over cash. Enraged, Charles shut it down. Then, realizing he was still broke, he had to call another parliament just 6 months later. This one, however, would prove a little harder to kill. Enter the Long Parliament, a gathering so stubborn that it practically refused to die until Cromwell himself stormed in with soldiers years later. Among its most prominent and vocal members was Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, once shy, now let everyone know exactly what he thought. Charles' imprisonments? Tyranny. His religious meddling? A joke. His Catholic wife? Suspicious. Parliament, feeling bold, made it illegal for Charles to dissolve them, which was like tying a toddler's hands so he couldn't break his own toys. Charles, meanwhile, hated this turn of events. But before he could figure out what to do, things got even worse. By 1641, the whole situation had deteriorated into chaos. There was a civil war in Ireland, a failed royalist coup in Scotland, and then Parliament decided to really drive the knife in with the Grand Remonstrance, a document that was essentially a list of all the reasons they hated Charles, written in the style of a particularly brutal Yelp review. Charles, feeling deeply offended and paranoid, came up with a brilliant plan. I'll just march into Parliament with soldiers and arrest my enemies. This was, of course, a horrible idea. On January 4th, 1642, he stormed into the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 MPs, only to find that they were gone. They had been tipped off and fled. Embarrassed and humiliated, Charles realized that London was no longer safe for him. On January 10th, he packed his things and fled to Oxford, his stronghold. There, he began raising an army. Parliament, naturally, responded in kind. By August 1642, England officially plunged into the First English Civil War, a bloody conflict that would ultimately claim 200,000 lives. This was also the moment when Oliver Cromwell, a man who started the war as a farmer with zero military experience, stepped into the spotlight. Embarrassed, he fled London and started raising an army. In August 1642, the English Civil War began, and England braced itself for total chaos. At first, Cromwell was just an MP, but when war broke out, he realized something. The Royalists had better cavalry. So, like any resourceful man, he went back to his home region, East Anglia, and personally raised a cavalry force, the Ironsides. These men were disciplined, fearless, and fought like demons. At the Battle of Marston Moor, 1644, Cromwell's cavalry crushed the Royalist horsemen. By 1645, Parliament passed a law removing all MPs from the army, but they made an exception for Cromwell because, well, they needed him. At the Battle of Naseby, 1645, Cromwell's cavalry completely destroyed the Royalist army. Charles fled north, disguised as a servant, and threw himself at the mercy of the Scots, who promptly sold him back to England for £100,000. Ouch. Chapter 5. Charles is his own worst enemy, and Cromwell is watching. Here's the funny thing. Cromwell didn't actually want to execute Charles. He wanted to restore him under a new constitutional system. But Charles had a habit of making terrible decisions. Instead of negotiating, he secretly conspired with the Scots to invade England and restore him to power. This kicked off the Second English Civil War, 1648, which Cromwell crushed with brutal efficiency. The Scots invaded late, and by the time they arrived, Cromwell had already defeated the other uprisings. When he met them in battle, he annihilated them. Charles was caught again, and this time Cromwell had had enough. Parliament purged itself of any MPs still loyal to the king, creating the Rump Parliament. Charles was put on trial for treason. In January 1649, Charles was sentenced to death. Only 59 MPs dared to sign his execution warrant, and Cromwell was one of them. On January 30th, Charles was led onto the scaffold in London. He made a speech about being a martyr, but the executioner didn't care. One clean stroke of the axe, and Charles I was no more. His head was held up for the crowd, and England officially became a republic. Now that Charles was gone, England was a republic, and Parliament was in charge. But there was still one problem: Ireland and Scotland. England had been tearing itself apart in civil war for years, but while Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan pals were busy chopping off King Charles I's head and playing political chess, Ireland had been having a rebellion of its own. Since 1641, Irish Catholics had been resisting English Protestant rule, and with England's attention on its own internal chaos, the rebellion had festered like an unattended wound. Then, in 1649, the English Civil War was finally over, or so people thought, and Parliament turned to its next problem: Those pesky, rebellious Irish. Who better to deal with them than England's greatest butcher? General, Oliver Cromwell. So off he went to Ireland with an army, a stern look on his face and absolutely zero interest in mercy. What followed were some of the most infamous massacres in British-Irish history. At Drogheda, Cromwell laid siege to the town, promising quarter to anyone who surrendered. But when his forces broke through the walls, he changed his mind. The slaughter was biblical. Royalist defenders, Irish soldiers, civilians, priests, Cromwell's men killed them all. He later justified it as a righteous judgment of God, which is a pretty fancy way of saying, we went overboard, but hey, God said it's fine. If Drogheda was bad, Wexford was worse. This time, Cromwell's forces stormed the town before surrender negotiations were even complete. Thousands were slaughtered, the town was burned, and any survivors were left wondering if hell might have been the better option. Even centuries later, the Irish still remember these massacres, and if ghosts hold grudges, Cromwell's spirit has a lot of angry company. Having turned Ireland into a charnel house, Cromwell returned to England in 1650, just in time to deal with yet another problem: Scotland. See, the Scots had decided that Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, was their rightful king. Naturally, Parliament wasn't thrilled about this and wanted Scotland crushed. But Thomas Fairfax, the previous commander-in-chief, refused to attack the Scots first. So Parliament did what Parliament always did when someone didn't do what they wanted. They handed the job to Cromwell. Cromwell marched north, and in September 1650 he crushed the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. A year later, in 1651, he finished the job at the Battle of Worcester. Charles II fled to the continent, after hiding in an oak tree of all things, and that was that. The civil wars were over. England, Scotland, and Ireland were now all under Cromwell's iron-fisted rule. But what does a war-winning general do in peacetime? Oh, don't worry. Cromwell wasn't about to sit back and relax. If there wasn't a war, he'd make one in Parliament. With the wars won, England needed a functioning government. Unfortunately, the Rump Parliament, the remains of the old Parliament that had survived the Civil War, was drunk on power. Instead of passing useful laws, it was busy doing what bad governments do best, making sure it stayed in power forever. By 1653, Cromwell had had enough. In a scene dripping with historical irony, he marched into Westminster with armed soldiers, just like Charles I had done years earlier when trying to arrest MPs. But unlike Charles, Cromwell actually succeeded. As he stormed in, he famously declared, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." And go they did. Cromwell dissolved Parliament by force, sending England's supposed democracy straight into the gutter. But England still needed some form of government. So in July 1653, Cromwell tried something new: bare-bones Parliament. Cromwell, ever the optimist, handpicked 144 men who he believed were godly, virtuous, and ready to build his Puritan utopia. Unfortunately, these saints turned out to be lunatics. They argued, they bickered, and instead of ruling, they did the one thing Cromwell didn't want them to do. They voted to dissolve themselves and hand all power over to him. It was like giving a toddler the keys to a candy store and being surprised when they eat everything. At this point, Cromwell stopped pretending. Parliament clearly couldn't be trusted to govern, so he took power for himself. On December 16, 1653, Cromwell officially became Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. This was technically not a monarchy, but it was also totally a monarchy. He lived in the royal palace. He was addressed as His Highness. He handed out knighthoods. He levied taxes. He dissolved Parliament whenever it annoyed him. If it walks like a king, talks like a king, and rules like a king, well, you get the idea. Hoping to make his government seem more legitimate, Cromwell called elections in 1654. Bad idea. The new Parliament was packed with Presbyterians, Royalists, and freethinkers who hated him. Instead of passing laws, they spent their time trying to cut his powers. Cromwell lasted 5 months before losing his patience and dissolving Parliament again. After the failed Parliament experiment, Cromwell divided England and Wales into 12 military districts, each ruled by a major general with absolute power. These were basically regional dictators who enforced Puritan laws, cracked down on fun, and made everyone miserable. People hated it. Even Cromwell eventually realized it was a disaster, so he scrapped it after a year. But by this point, Cromwell had bigger problems. His own supporters were starting to turn on him. In a twist that should have been obvious from the start, Parliament, which Cromwell had conveniently packed with his allies, voted to make him king in February 1657. To his credit, Cromwell refused. Sort of. Instead of taking the title of king, he kept the title Lord Protector, but still accepted the royal ceremony, the new powers, and the fancy robes. Basically, he became a king in everything but name. By early 1658, Cromwell was exhausted. He had spent years fighting wars, crushing rebellions, dissolving parliaments, and playing politics. His health deteriorated rapidly, and on September 3, 1658, he finally died. His son, Richard Cromwell, took over as Lord Protector, but he was about as effective as a chocolate sword. Within 2 years, Charles II was back on the throne, and the monarchy was restored. And so, after all his efforts to destroy kingship, Cromwell's England ended up right back where it started, with a king on the throne. The moral of the story? If you fight against monarchy long enough, you might just end up becoming one yourself.